The year was 1968, the absolute frozen heart of the Cold War. It was an era defined by a terrifying paradox: mutually assured destruction. While the world's population lived in the shadow of a sun that could be ignited by a button, a much quieter and more lethal war was being fought beneath the waves of the world's oceans. This was the age of the boomers, ballistic missile submarines that could disappear for months, carrying enough nuclear fire to end civilization. Among the most feared was the Soviet Pacific Fleet's K-129. The K-129 was a Gulf II class diesel-electric submarine, a 330-foot-long steel predator. It wasn't the most modern ship in the Soviet arsenal, but it was deadly. It carried a crew of 98 hand-picked sailors and 3 massive R-21 ballistic missiles. These weren't just rockets. They were sea-launched nuclear warheads capable of reaching targets over 1,400 kilometers away. In February 1968, the K-129 slipped silently out of the jagged, frozen coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Its mission was a surge deployment, a combat patrol meant to signal Soviet strength in the North Pacific. For 24 days, the K-129 operated in total radio silence, sliding through the turbulent gray waters of the Pacific. Then, on March 8, 1968, it missed a scheduled burst transmission. In the Soviet Naval Command Center in Vladivostok, the silence was initially treated as a technical glitch. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into a week, the silence transformed into a cold, paralyzing dread. The K-129 had vanished. The Soviet reaction was massive and desperate. They didn't just lose a ship, they lost 3 nuclear warheads, and more importantly, the daily encryption codebooks and the top-secret mechanical cipher machines. If the Americans found that submarine, the entire Soviet naval communication network would be compromised. The Kremlin ordered the largest search and rescue operation in human history. Dozens of Soviet destroyers, frigates, and submarines swarmed the North Pacific. They dropped sonar buoys by the hundreds and crisscrossed the waves with reconnaissance planes, searching for any sign of an oil slick, a piece of debris, or a radiation spike. But the Soviets were blind. They were searching based on the K-129's last reported position, a coordinate that was tragically inaccurate by hundreds of miles. For 2 agonizing months, the Soviet fleet hunted a ghost in the wrong part of the ocean. Finally, exhausted, with fuel running low and morale collapsing, the Soviet Navy called off the search. They declared the K-129 and her 98 crewmen lost to the abyss, officially presumed to have suffered a battery explosion or a mechanical failure. They believed the Pacific had swallowed their secrets forever, burying them under 16,000 feet of crushing water where no human technology could ever reach. They were wrong, because while the Soviets were searching, the Americans had been listening. Deep in the windowless rooms of the U.S. Navy's intelligence centers, analysts were looking at data from SOSUS, the sound surveillance system. This was a classified global network of hypersensitive underwater microphones bolted directly into the seabed. On the exact night the K-129 disappeared, SOSUS stations from the California coast to the tip of the Aleutian Islands had recorded a distinct, violent, hydroacoustic event. It began with the sharp, metallic snap of a pressure hull collapsing under thousands of pounds of per square inch pressure, followed by the muffled, low-frequency roar of a massive explosion. By triangulating the microsecond differences in the arrival of that sound across multiple stations, the U.S. Navy achieved a miracle of physics. They didn't just have a general area, they had a bullseye. They knew exactly where the K-129 lay. It was resting 4,900 meters deep on the abyssal plain, north of Midway Island, over 500 miles away from where the Soviets had been searching. In the summer of 1968, the USS Halibut, a specially modified spy submarine, was dispatched to the site. Using a remote-controlled underwater camera sled, the crew of the Halibut found the grave. The K-129 was shattered. The hull was broken in 2, but the most vital part, the sail and the missile tubes, remained largely intact. When the photos reached the CIA's headquarters in Langley, the atmosphere changed. This wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a gold mine. If they could recover that submarine, the US would gain access to Soviet nuclear technology, missile guidance systems, and the holy grail of intelligence, the Soviet naval codes. But there was a problem that bordered on the impossible. No one in history had ever lifted 2,000 tons of steel from 3 miles down. The pressure at that depth is over 7,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a tank like a soda can. To the CIA, the impossibility was an invitation. They called it Project Azorian. It would become the most expensive and complex covert operation in history. But to pull it off, they would need more than just engineers. They would need a cover story so grand and so strange that the Soviets would never suspect the truth. They were about to build a ship that didn't exist, to perform a heist that couldn't be done, funded by a billionaire who was slowly losing his mind. The heist of the century was about to begin. With the grainy photos from the USS Halibut spread across the intelligence analysts' tables, the CIA knew it possessed the greatest treasure of the Cold War. However, they faced a literal and logistical abyss. The K-129 lay at a staggering depth of 4,900 meters, over 16,000 feet. To put this into chilling perspective, the Titanic rests at approximately 3,800 meters. The pressure at that depth is roughly 500 atmospheres, or 7,250 pounds per square inch, enough to instantaneously crush any conventional submersible or salvage equipment like a soda can. The agency needed something that had never been built, a vessel capable of lifting a 2,000-ton steel monster through 3 miles of crushing water, without the ship breaking apart, or crucially, without the Soviet Union ever realizing what was happening. Richard Helms, the director of the CIA at the time, understood the geopolitical tightrope they were walking. He couldn't simply dispatch a U.S. Navy vessel to the middle of the Pacific and begin a highly suspicious, months-long salvage operation directly over a Soviet nuclear submarine. Soviet spy ships, known as AGIs, intelligence oceanographic vessels, were ubiquitous in international waters. If they saw a military vessel stationed over the wreck site for weeks on end, the carefully constructed charade would unravel, potentially escalating into a direct confrontation, or worse, a nuclear Third World War. The solution needed to be civilian, commercially viable in appearance and, above all, bizarre enough to deflect any serious international scrutiny. It was at this critical juncture that the CIA turned to the only figure in America who possessed both the staggering wealth and the necessary aura of eccentric mystery: Howard Hughes. Hughes, the reclusive billionaire industrialist, aviator, and Hollywood magnate, was famously living in total isolation in penthouse suites across Las Vegas, consumed by acute germophobia and paranoia. However, his vast corporate empire, specifically the Hughes Tool Company, and later Summa Corporation, provided the perfect, impenetrable corporate facade. The CIA proposed a Faustian bargain. Hughes would lend his name, his corporate structure, and his immense public image to the construction of a gigantic ship under the pretext of launching a revolutionary new industry: deep-sea mining of manganese nodules. The cover story was meticulously crafted and expertly sold to the global press. Eccentric billionaire invests a fortune to mine the ocean floor for strategic minerals. The world, captivated by Hughes's larger-than-life persona, largely believed it. After all, it was precisely the kind of grandiose, unconventional venture that Howard Hughes was infamous for. While the public devoured headlines about the new oceanic gold rush in a highly secured dry dock at the Sun Shipbuilding Yard in Chester, Pennsylvania, the clandestine construction of the Hughes Glomar Explorer began. The Glomar Explorer was a colossal vessel, an industrial monstrosity stretching 188 meters, 618 feet in length, and displacing 36,000 tons. But her true magic, her covert genius, lay within her hidden core. At the very center of the ship, cutting through her entire hull, was a gargantuan opening known as the Moon Pool, an internal submersible hangar with massive retractable bottom doors that could open directly to the ocean below. This ingenious design allowed the recovered object to be secretly hoisted directly into the belly of the ship, completely shielded from the prying eyes of Soviet spy ships, satellites, or even curious commercial vessels. But how could one physically lower 3 miles of intricate piping to grasp a submarine weighing thousands of tons? Conventional crane engineering was utterly useless at such depths. The Project Azorian team, a blend of CIA operatives, naval engineers, and deep-sea oil drilling experts, designed a revolutionary drill string system similar to that used in offshore oil platforms, but on an unprecedented scale. They meticulously engineered hundreds of high-strength steel pipe sections, each 60 feet long, that had to be painstakingly connected one by one, descending through the moon pool towards the abyssal plain. At the very end of this colossal drill string, deep in the absolute blackness, would be the central piece of the heist, Clementine. Clementine was a truly monstrous mechanical claw, weighing hundreds of tons, designed with massive, hydraulically powered articulated fingers specifically engineered to encircle and grip the fragile, collapsed hull of the K-129. To guide Clementine to her target in the pitch-black, crushing depths, she was equipped with powerful strobe lights, sensitive low-light TV cameras, and precision thrusters for fine positional adjustments. It was, in essence, a deep-sea robotic probe operating under unimaginable pressures, executing a task worthy of science fiction. The cost of Project Azorian began to climb vertiginously, rapidly exceeding initial estimates and reaching a staggering mark of $800 million, equivalent to approximately $4 billion in today's money. Within the CIA, the project was quietly nicknamed the Accountant's Nightmare. But the promise of retrieving 3 intact R-21 nuclear missiles, and crucially, the Soviet code tables and cryptographic equipment, was an intelligence prize too tantalizing, too strategically vital to abandon. The Glomar Explorer was not merely a ship. It was the largest, most expensive, and most technologically advanced covert intelligence gathering device ever conceived and constructed. As the ship neared completion, the political climate in the United States was increasingly volatile. The Watergate scandal was beginning to boil in Washington, casting a long shadow of paranoia over government operations. The CIA lived in constant fear that any leak would expose and destroy Project Azorian. Simultaneously, out in the vastness of the Pacific, the Soviet Navy remained on high alert. They had indeed noticed the unusual construction of the Glomar Explorer, but Hughes's cover story was so convincing, and the very concept of salvaging something from 5 kilometers down was so utterly preposterous that the Kremlin merely observed from a distance, never suspecting that Howard Hughes's mining vessel was about to attempt the greatest intelligence heist in human history right under their very noses. In the summer of 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer finally slipped its moorings and began its long, clandestine journey toward the center of the North Pacific. To any passing observer, it was a marvel of industrial ambition, a billionaire's toy designed to pull riches from the seabed. But inside the hull, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating tension of a high-stakes military operation. The crew was a strange mix: world-class deep-sea drillers who thought they were mining for manganese, and a core group of CIA operatives and technical specialists who knew they were about to commit the ultimate act of international piracy. As the ship reached the exact coordinates north of Midway, the operation, codenamed Project Azorian, entered its most critical phase. The Pacific, however, was not welcoming. Massive swells battered the ship, testing the experimental dynamic positioning system that used satellite data and thrusters to keep the vessel perfectly stationary over a target 3 miles below. If the ship moved more than a few meters, the 3-mile-long pipe string would snap like a dry twig under the immense tension. On the bridge, the CIA mission directors watched the monitors with bated breath. The heavy lifting began. One by one, the 60-foot sections of high-strength steel pipe were hoisted into the derrick, threaded together, and lowered through the moon pool. The drill string was a masterpiece of metallurgy, but at 16,000 feet, it behaved more like a wet noodle than a solid rod. It swayed and pulsed with the currents of the deep ocean, carrying the 100-ton mechanical claw, Clementine, toward the abyss. But as the claw descended into the absolute darkness, the mission hit its first major crisis. A Soviet naval tug, the Chazma, appeared on the horizon. For the CIA, this was the ultimate nightmare. The Soviets had become suspicious of the Glomar Explorer's mining operation. The Chazma didn't just pass by, it lingered. It began to circle the Glomar Explorer, its crew taking photographs of every inch of the ship's superstructure. At one point, a Soviet helicopter took off from the tug and hovered directly over the Glomar's deck, so close that the Americans could see the pilots' faces. Inside the ship, the CIA ordered a stealth protocol. All sensitive equipment was hidden. The men on deck were told to act like bored commercial sailors. They even staged a mock manganese nodule processing session to maintain the cover. But beneath their feet, the massive winch was still slowly lowering the claw toward the radioactive grave of the K-129. The tension was unbearable. If the Soviets saw the drill string or realized the ship had a hole in its bottom, they would likely board the vessel, triggering an international incident that could lead to open warfare. For days, the Soviet ship sat just a few hundred yards away, watching. But the CIA's cover story, backed by the legendary name of Howard Hughes, held firm. The Soviets couldn't conceive that the Americans were capable of reaching such depths. They eventually concluded that the ship was exactly what it claimed to be, a massive, expensive, and likely failing commercial venture. The Chashma finally turned away and vanished into the fog. With the immediate threat gone, the team focused back on the monitors. After weeks of painstaking lowering, the low-light cameras on Clementine finally caught a glimpse of the bottom. Through the swirling silt of the abyssal plain, a jagged, dark shape emerged. It was the sail of the K-129. The sight was haunting. The submarine looked like a broken toy, crushed and twisted by the weight of the ocean, surrounded by a debris field of personal effects, classified documents, and twisted steel. But the claw was not lined up. The currents at the bottom were stronger than anticipated. Clementine was swaying wildly, threatening to smash into the submarine and destroy the very components the CIA needed to steal. They were at the point of no return. The heist of the century was down to a few centimeters of movement in the pitch-black heart of the Pacific. One wrong move, and $800 million of technology, and the chance to unlock the Soviet Union's nuclear secrets would be lost forever. 3 miles below the surface of the North Pacific, the environment is as hostile as the surface of a distant planet. The temperature is near freezing, the pressure is a bone-crushing 7,000 pounds per square inch, and the darkness is absolute. Into this void descended Clementine, the CIA's billion-dollar mechanical predator. On the bridge of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, the technical crews sat in a darkened room, their faces illuminated by the ghostly green glow of the low-light television monitors. They were watching the heist of the century unfold in slow motion. The cameras mounted on the heavy steel beams of the claw began to pick up the first traces of the debris field. It started with small, unrecognizable fragments of twisted aluminum and jagged shards of battery casings. Then a boot appeared in the silt. Then a scattered pile of Soviet manuals, their Cyrillic text still miraculously legible in the beam of the strobe lights. Finally, the massive, dark silhouette of the K-129 emerged from the gloom. The submarine was a wreck of monumental proportions. The bow was shattered, and the hull was buckled. But the center section, the target zone containing the ballistic missiles and the cryptographic room, was sitting upright in the silt. The sight sent a chill through the CIA operatives. They weren't just looking at a ship. They were looking at a nuclear tomb containing the remains of 98 Soviet sailors. The maneuver was agonizingly slow. Because of the drill string's incredible length, there was a significant delay between the commands given on the ship and the reaction of the claw 3 miles below. It was like trying to pick up a fragile egg with a pair of tweezers attached to the end of a long swaying fishing rod. For hours, the pilots used the precision thrusters on Clementine to align the massive hydraulic fingers with the K-129's hull. "Contact," whispered a technician. A dull metallic thud vibrated up the 3 miles of steel pipe, felt more than heard by the sensors on the Glomar Explorer. The massive fingers of Clementine began to close. This was the moment of truth. The fingers were designed to dig beneath the submarine's hull, cradling the 2,000-ton mass of steel and silt like a giant hand. As the hydraulic pressure built up, the fingers bit into the seabed. The monitors showed clouds of silt erupting into the water, obscuring everything. "We have a lock," the mission director announced. The massive winches on the Glomar Explorer began to turn. The strain on the ship's derrick was immense. The weight of the pipe string alone was over 6 million pounds, adding the weight of a waterlogged submarine, and the suction of the ocean floor pushed the equipment to its absolute breaking point. The entire ship groaned and vibrated as the heavy lifting began. Slowly, inch by painful inch, the K-129 was pulled from the mud that had held it for 6 years. For the first 1,000 feet of the ascent, the mood on the ship was one of cautious euphoria. They had done the impossible. They had snatched a Soviet nuclear submarine from the floor of the abyss. But as the K-129 rose higher, the physics of the recovery began to change. The internal gases trapped in the submarine began to expand as the external pressure decreased. The structural integrity of the Soviet steel, already weakened by the initial explosion and years of saltwater corrosion, began to fail under its own massive weight. Suddenly, a violent shudder ripped through the drill string. On the monitors, the unthinkable happened. One of the massive steel fingers on Clementine, a component made of the strongest alloy known to man, snapped under the stress. The failure was catastrophic. With one finger gone, the balance of the load shifted violently. The K-129, held in an uneven grip, began to tilt. The stress was too much for the fractured hull. Before the horrified eyes of the CIA team, the submarine began to disintegrate. The aft section, containing the engine room and the stern, broke away and plummeted back toward the abyss. But the tragedy didn't stop there. As the ship shook, the center section, the section containing the missiles and the top-secret code books, also slipped from the claw's grasp. The most valuable parts of the heist, the targets the CIA had spent $800 million to acquire, fell away like a stone in a well, disappearing back into the darkness. The only thing left in Clementine's grip was a 38-foot section of the submarine's bow. A heavy, deathly silence fell over the bridge of the Glomar Explorer. Years of work, the involvement of a billionaire, the construction of the world's most advanced ship, and the risk of nuclear war had all culminated in a partial, heartbreaking failure. They were left with a fragment of the bow, an area mostly containing the torpedo room and the remains of several crewmen. The nuclear missiles and the cryptographic secrets were gone, settled back onto the ocean floor in a new, even more scattered debris field. But the mission wasn't over. They still had to bring the bow section into the moon pool without the Soviet spy ships, which were still patrolling the area, seeing the radioactive wreckage they had managed to save. The Azorian heist had turned from a triumph into a desperate scramble to save whatever small pieces of intelligence remained in the claw. The atmosphere inside the Hughes Glomar Explorer was a suffocating mixture of mourning and frantic activity. The mechanical failure of Clementine's fingers had been a knife to the heart of the mission. On the monitors, the CIA directors had watched the most valuable parts of the K-129, the missile silos and the cryptographic room, slip away and vanish into the blackness of the abyss. What remained in the claw's grip was a mangled 38-foot section of the submarine's bow. As the winch continued its slow mechanical rhythm, pulling the remnants of the Soviet sub toward the surface, a new and invisible danger began to manifest: radiation. The K-129 was a nuclear-armed vessel. Although the missiles had fallen back to the seabed, the bow section contained nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Years of saltwater corrosion and the violent stress of the sinking had potentially compromised the warheads. As the bow neared the ship, Geiger counters throughout the lower decks began to click with an ominous increasing frequency. The recovery team had to don heavy, lead-lined suits, transforming the interior of the world's most advanced ship into a scene from a sci-fi nightmare. At 2 a.m., the massive bottom doors of the moon pool finally groaned open. This was the secret heart of the Glomar Explorer, a giant internal hangar filled with millions of gallons of seawater. Slowly, the broken bow of the K-129 rose through the churning foam, emerging from the depths for the first time in 6 years. As the water was pumped out and the hangar was sealed, the CIA specialists finally stood face to face with their prize. It was a haunting sight. The steel was jagged and blackened, covered in a fine layer of abyssal silt that smelled of sulfur and decay. But as the technicians began to inspect the wreckage with remote cameras and high-intensity lights, they found something they hadn't fully prepared for: the crew. Entombed within the twisted wreckage of the torpedo room were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. Because of the extreme cold and the unique chemistry of the deep ocean, the bodies had not fully decomposed, they were preserved in a ghostly, wax-like state. For the CIA operatives, many of whom were veterans of the shadowy world of espionage, this was a moment of profound human realization. These were not just targets or intelligence assets. These were young men, sons, brothers, and fathers, who had died in a terrifying instant of mechanical failure thousands of miles from home. The intelligence value of the bow section was quickly assessed. They found 2 nuclear torpedoes, which provided a massive windfall for US scientists studying Soviet nuclear yields. They also found several technical manuals and acoustic equipment. But the Grand Slam, the codebooks, remained at the bottom of the ocean. However, a pressing diplomatic and ethical problem remained: what to do with the bodies. The CIA was in a legal and moral minefield. If they kept the bodies for study, they would be violating every international maritime law and naval tradition. If they reported the find to the Soviet Union, they would reveal the entire mission, potentially triggering a war. The decision was made by the highest levels of the US government. The Soviet sailors would be given a full military funeral at sea, conducted in secret and recorded for history. On a foggy Pacific night, while Soviet spy ships were still patrolling just miles away, a section of the Glomar Explorer's deck was cleared. The 6 sailors were placed in heavy metal caskets draped with the Soviet flag, the very flag of the nation they had died serving. A CIA officer who spoke fluent Russian performed the service, reciting the traditional naval prayers. The caskets were then slid into the dark waters of the Pacific as a band played the Soviet national anthem in a low, somber tone. The entire ceremony was filmed with a 16mm camera, a piece of evidence intended to prove to the Kremlin, if the mission were ever exposed, that the US had treated their fallen with the utmost honor. As the last casket vanished beneath the waves, the crew of the Glomar Explorer stood in a silent salute. They had stolen a piece of a nuclear giant, but in the process, they had become the final guardians of its secrets and its dead. The mission was now a partial success, but the CIA wasn't finished. Even as they headed back toward port, with the radioactive bow hidden in the belly of the ship, plans were already being drawn for a second mission, a return to the abyss to finish what Clementine had started and retrieve the missiles that had slipped away. As the Hughes Glomar Explorer steamed back toward the coast of California, the CIA was already celebrating. Despite the structural failure that saw the majority of the K-129 plummet back to the seabed, they had secured 2 nuclear torpedoes and invaluable intelligence on Soviet metallurgy and sonar. The mission had remained, miraculously, a total secret from the Soviet Union. The manganese mining cover story had held up under the scrutiny of Soviet spy ships and global media alike. The CIA was already drafting the budget for Project Matador, the sequel mission to return to the coordinates and retrieve the lost missile section. They believed they were untouchable, but the downfall of the world's most sophisticated intelligence operation wouldn't come from a Soviet satellite or a high-level mole in Langley. It would come from a group of common street thieves in Los Angeles. On the night of June 5, 1974, while the Glomar Explorer was still in the middle of the Pacific, 4 burglars broke into the offices of the Hughes Tool Company at 7000 Romaine Street in Hollywood. The thieves weren't looking for international secrets. They were looking for cash and jewelry belonging to the reclusive Howard Hughes. They blew open a safe and escaped with $68,000 in cash and several stacks of documents. Among those documents was a single, innocuous-looking memo. It was a communication between Hughes's executives and the CIA, explicitly linking the Hughes Glomar Explorer to a secret government project to recover a sunken Soviet submarine. The burglars, realizing they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a heist, attempted to ransom the documents back to Hughes for $1 million. When Hughes refused to pay, the thieves contacted the press. Suddenly, the most sensitive secret of the Cold War was sitting in the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department and a few investigative journalists. The CIA entered a state of absolute emergency. They leaned on every contact they had in the media. Legendary director William Colby personally visited the offices of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, pleading with them not to publish the story. He argued that exposing the project would not only waste $800 million of taxpayer money, but could also lead to a direct military confrontation with the USSR, who were still unaware that their radioactive tomb had been violated. For months, the media held the story out of a sense of patriotic duty, but the pressure was building. Investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, the man who had exposed the My Lai massacre, was on the trail. He knew the CIA was hiding a gargantuan secret. The breaking point came in March 1975. A small column in the Los Angeles Times mentioned the burglary and hinted at the CIA connection. Once the seal was broken, the floodgates opened. On March 18, 1975, the New York Times ran a front-page exposé. CIA salvage ship brought up part of Soviet sub. The news hit the Kremlin like a physical blow. The Soviet leadership was humiliated. They had spent months watching the Glomar Explorer, even sending ships to circle it, and they had believed the American cover story about mining. Now, they were forced to admit to their own people and the world that the Americans had the technology to reach the bottom of the abyss and steal their nuclear secrets. The Soviet Navy was immediately ordered to the K-129 site with instructions to sink any American ship that approached. Project Matador, the second mission, was cancelled instantly. The CIA was forced into a humiliating diplomatic corner. When asked for details by the press, the agency issued a response that has since become legendary in the world of law and espionage. We can neither confirm nor deny that the information requested exists or is within our possession. This became known as the Glomar response. It was a verbal wall, a way to hide the truth without technically lying. But the damage was done. The most audacious heist in history had been exposed not by a master spy but by a botched robbery in Hollywood. The CIA had conquered the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, but they couldn't survive the scrutiny of a free press. While the political world was exploding with the Glomar response and the public exposure of the mission, behind the heavy, lead-lined doors of a classified naval facility in California, the real work was just beginning. The 38-foot mangled section of the K-129's bow had been carefully extracted from the Glomar Explorer's moon pool and placed in a specialized isolation chamber. For the scientists and weapons experts of the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence, this was the equivalent of examining an alien spacecraft. The section they had recovered was the forward torpedo room. It was a twisted labyrinth of pipes, valves, and electrical conduits, all coated in a thick, toxic layer of seabed silt and oxidized Soviet steel. But nestled within the wreckage were two Type 53 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. These were the primary targets of the technical analysis. U.S. scientists began a painstaking reverse engineering process. They weren't just looking at the explosives. They were analyzing the metallurgy of the hull, the quality of the welding, and the sophistication of the Soviet guidance electronics. What they found was shocking. The Soviet technology was far more rugged and resilient than American intelligence had previously estimated. By analyzing the radioactive isotopes in the warheads, the U.S. was able to determine the exact yield of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, a piece of data that allowed the Pentagon to recalibrate the entire defense strategy for the Pacific Fleet. But the most haunting discovery was found in the forensic analysis of the hull itself. For years, the official U.S. theory was that the K-129 had suffered a catastrophic battery explosion during charging, a common danger in diesel-electric submarines. However, as the engineers examined the way the steel had peeled and buckled, a new, more terrifying theory emerged, the missile launch theory. Evidence suggested that one of the three R-21 ballistic missiles in the sail might have accidentally ignited while the submarine was submerged. The resulting inferno would have turned the K-129 into a pressurized furnace in seconds. The heat would have been so intense that it warped the internal bulkheads before the hull finally succumbed to the crushing pressure of the ocean. This discovery sent shockwaves through the U.S. Navy. If Soviet missiles could accidentally ignite in their silos, every Soviet submarine currently patrolling the U.S. coast was a ticking nuclear time bomb. Furthermore, the recovery of the bow allowed the CIA to study the Soviet acoustic signature. By examining the design of the propeller shafts, though the propellers themselves were in the section that fell back, and the internal machinery mounts, U.S. acoustic engineers could fine-tune the SOSUS microphones to better identify the specific sound of Soviet Gulf-class submarines. This meant that for the remainder of the Cold War, the USSR could no longer hide their older diesel boats from American ears. Yet as the scientists poked and probed the wreckage, they were constantly reminded of the human cost. They found personal items, a locket, a rusted watch, a half-written letter, that belonged to the 6 sailors they had buried at sea. These artifacts were never returned to the Soviet Union. They were filed away in classified boxes, labeled as top-secret remnants of a mission that officially never happened. The technical windfall of Project Azorian was massive, but it was incomplete. The CIA knew that just a few miles away from where they had grabbed the bow, the Holy Grail still lay on the seabed, the missile section and the cryptographic room. They had the torpedoes, but they didn't have the codes. They had the body of the mystery, but the brain remained at 5,000 meters. As the 1970s drew to a close, the K-129 bow section was eventually cut into pieces and melted down to hide its origin, leaving behind only the top-secret reports and the haunting 16mm film of the burial at sea. The greatest heist in history had provided the US with a map of the enemy's soul, but it had also left them with the realization that some secrets are so heavy they can never be fully lifted from the darkness. The exposure of Project Azorian by the American press in 1975 did more than just cancel the sequel mission, Project Matador. It created a diplomatic deep freeze that threatened the fragile era of détente between Washington and Moscow. For the Soviet leadership, the realization that the CIA had spent nearly $1 billion to rob a grave was a humiliation of the highest order. They were forced to reconcile with the fact that their naval security had been breached at the bottom of the abyss. However, the Cold War was a world of mirrors. Publicly, the Soviets protested the desecration of their war grave. Privately, their naval engineers were terrified. They realized that if the Americans could lift a submarine from 5,000 meters, no Soviet secret, on land or at sea, was safe. This realization triggered a massive, expensive redesign of the entire Soviet submarine fleet, forcing them to spend billions to harden their ships against the very surveillance and recovery techniques the US had just demonstrated. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, the ship that shouldn't have existed, became a ghost of the intelligence world. After the mission was exposed, the CIA no longer had a use for it. The billionaire coverman Howard Hughes died in 1976, leaving the ship's legal status in a tangled mess. For years, the massive vessel sat in mothballs, a silent witness to the most expensive heist in history. Eventually, it was leased to commercial mining companies, ironically performing the very job it had been invented to fake, before finally being sold for scrap in 2015. The Clementine claw, the mechanical hand that had grasped a nuclear giant, was broken apart and melted down, its specialized alloys disappearing back into the industrial cycle. But the story of the K-129 had one final emotional act. In 1992, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world was a different place. The Cold War was over, and the new Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, was attempting to build a bridge to the West. In a gesture of unprecedented transparency and peace, the director of the CIA, Robert Gates, traveled to Moscow. He didn't come with empty hands. In a quiet room in the Kremlin, Gates handed Yeltsin a videotape and a small wooden box. On the tape was the secret 16mm footage of the burial at sea conducted on the deck of the Glomar Explorer in 1974. Yeltsin and the Russian naval commanders watched in stunned silence as they saw their own sailors, men who had been erased by Soviet bureaucracy for decades, being given a full military funeral with the Soviet national anthem playing. The box contained the Soviet flag that had draped the caskets. It was a moment of profound closure. For the families of the 98 men who died on the K-129, the heist of the century had finally been transformed into a story of human respect. The Americans had tried to steal their secrets, yes, but they had also honored their dead when their own country could not even find them. The legacy of Project Azorian lives on in the very language of government. The Glomar response, the phrase neither confirm nor deny, remains a standard legal tool used by agencies worldwide to protect sensitive information. It is a linguistic monument to a ship that dared to reach into the darkness. Ultimately, the K-129 remains a divided ship. The bow was analyzed and destroyed by the Americans. The rest of the hull, with its nuclear missiles and the remaining 92 crewmen, still rests on the abyssal plain, 4,900 meters deep. It is a place of absolute silence, far beyond the reach of the sun, where the crushing weight of the Pacific keeps the final secrets of the Cold War. The Azorian heist proved that while humans can conquer the depths of the ocean and the complexities of engineering, the true weight of history is something that can never be fully lifted.